Chapter 30. 10 days following Shannara's midnight assault, the army of the Warlock Lord attacked the elves at the Valley of Ren. The elves were not caught unprepared. All that night, the level of activity in the enemy camp had been unusually high. Watchfires were built up until it seemed as if the entire grassland were ablaze. The siege machines that had been salvaged from the raid were hauled forward, massive giants looming out of the night. The squares, bulky towers, swaying and creaking, the long bent arms of the catapults and throwers, casting their shadows like broken limbs. Long before daybreak, the various units of the army began to assemble, and from as far away as the head of the pass, the elves could hear the sounds of armour and weapons being strapped in place. The heavy tromp of booted feet signalled the forming up of battle units. Horses were saddled and brought around, and the cavalry mounted and rode off to assume positions on the army's flanks, warding the archers and foot soldiers. There was no mistaking what was happening, and Shannara was quick to respond. The king had used well the time that his raid had gained him. It had taken the Northlanders even longer to recover than he had hoped. The damage his raid had inflicted on the siege machines and supply wagons was extensive, requiring that new machines be built, old ones be repaired, and more supplies be brought down from the north. Some of the scattered horses were recovered, but a large number had to be replaced. The Northland army swelled anew as further reinforcements arrived, but the elves were encouraged by the fact that they had damaged the superior force so easily. It had given them renewed hope, and the king was quick to take advantage of it. The first thing Yul did was to relocate the greater part of his army, from the west end of the valley to the east, from the narrow pass to the broad mouth, opening onto the flats. His reasoning was simple. While it was easier to defend the deeper pass, he preferred to engage the enemy farther out and make it fight for every foot of ground as it advanced through the valley. The danger, of course, lay in spreading his lesser force too thinly before a superior army. But to offset that risk, the king employed his engineering corps to construct a series of deadly traps in the wide gap opening out onto the plains through which the Northlanders must pass. He met as well with his commanders to discuss strategy, working out a complex but comprehensive set of alternatives he believed would offset the magnitude of the Northland strike. The larger army would win if it could bring its superior size and strength to bear. The trick was to prevent this from happening. So when dawn arrived on that 10th day, and the Northland army stood revealed, the elves were waiting. 4 companies of foot soldiers and archers stood arrayed across the wide mouth of the valley's east entrance, arms at the ready. Cavalry under Keir Yoplin had already fanned out to either side along the fringe of the westland forest that screened the cliffs and hills. On the high ground, 3 more companies of Elven hunters had set themselves in place, warded by earthworks and barricades, with bows, slings, and spears in hand. But the army assembled before them was truly daunting. It numbered well over 10,000, spread out all across the plains for as far as the eye could see. The huge rock trolls stood centremost, their great pikes lifted in a forest of wood and iron. Lesser trolls and gnomes flanked and fronted them. Heavy cavalry ranged behind, lances set in stirrup rests. Twin siege towers bracketed the army, and catapults and throwers were scattered through its midst. In the blaze of new sunlight and old shadows, the Northland army looked to be large enough to crush any obstacle it encountered. There was an expectant silence as the sun lifted out of the horizon and the new day began. The 2 armies faced each other across the grassland, armour and weapons glinting, pennants flying in a soft breeze, the sky a strange mix of brightening blue and fading grey. Clouds sailed overhead in vast, thick masses that threatened rain before the day was through. The acrid smell of scorched earth wafted on the air, a residue from the watchfire's douse. Horses stamped nervously and shifted in their traces. Men took deep breaths and closed off thoughts of home and family and better times. When the Northern Army began its advance towards the valley, the earth shook with the sound. Drums thudded in a steady cadence to mark time for the foot soldiers marching in step. The wheels of the catapults and siege machines rumbled. Boots and hooves thudded so heavily that the trembling of the ground could be felt all the way back to where the elves stood waiting. Dust began to rise from the parched plains, the wind stirring it in wild clouds, and the size of the army seemed to swell even more, to rise on the dust as if fed by it. The silence shattered, and the light changed. In the roar of the dust and thunder of the army's coming, death lifted its head in expectation and looked about. Shannara sat atop his charger, a white-faced bay called Risk, and watched in silence as the enemy advanced. He did not like the effect that it was having on his men. The sheer number of the enemy was disheartening, and the sound of its coming was immense and heart-stopping. The king could feel. He could fear it generated in his soldiers. His impatience with what was happening began to grate on him. He began to work against his own resolve. Finally, he could abide it no longer. Impulsively, he spurred forward to the head of his army, leaving Priya, Bremen, and his personal guard staring after him in shock. Charging to the fore, exposed to all, he reined in and began to walk, brisk up and down the front rank, speaking boldly to the elven hunters who stood there looking up at him in delighted surprise. "Steady now," he called out calmly, smiling, nodding and greeting, meeting every pair of eyes. "Size alone won't make the difference. This is our ground, our home, our birthright, our nation. We cannot be driven from it by an invader who lacks heart. We cannot be defeated while we believe in ourselves. Stay strong. Remember what we have planned for them. Remember what we must do. They will break first, I promise you. Keep steady. Keep your wits." So he went, up and down the lines, pausing now and again to ask the man he recognized some small questions, demonstrating to them the confidence he felt, reminding them of the courage he knew they possessed. He did not bother to glance at the juggernaut that approached. He pointedly ignored it. "They are nothing to us," he was saying. "They are already beaten." When the behemoth was 200 yards away, the thunder of its approach so pervasive that there was room for no other sound. He raised his arm in salute to his elven hunters, wheeled Risk into their front rank, and took his place among them. Dust gusted across the plains, shrouding the marching army and the rolling machines. Drums hammered out the cadence. The siege weapons lurched closer, hauled forward by massive ropes and trains of pack animals. Swords and pikes glittered in the dusky light. Then, when the advancing army was 150 yards away, Shannara signaled for the planes to be fired. Forward raced a long line of archers, dropping to one knee to light their arrows. 6-foot-long bows were lifted and tilted skyward, and bowstrings were drawn taut and released. The arrows flew into the midst of the Northland army, landing in grasses that the elves had soaked with oil under cover of darkness the night before. When they knew the attack was at hand, flames sprang to life all about, rising into the dust-clogged air, blazing skyward amid the close-set enemy ranks. Down the long lines the fire raced, and the Northland army slowed and broke apart as the scream of frightened men and animals rose in the morning air. But the army did not retreat or try to flee. Instead it charged its forward ranks, breaking free of the deadly flames. Gnome archers loosed their arrows in wild bursts, but they lacked even elven longbows, and the arrows fell short. The soldiers with their hand weapons came on, howling in rage, anxious to close with the enemy that had surprised them. fully 1,000 in number, most of them gnomes and lesser trolls. Ill-disciplined and impulsive, they surged forward into the trap that waited. Shannara held his soldiers in place, the bowmen drawn back again into the ranks of elven hunters. When the enemy was close enough to smell, he brought up his sword and signalled to the haulers to set in lines amid the swordsmen. Back they pulled on the heavy grease ropes concealed in the grasses, and dozens of barricades, but trussed with sharpened stakes, lifted to meet the rush. The attackers were too close, too slow, pressed on by those who pushed from behind, and were driven onto the deadly spikes. Some tried to cut at the ropes, but the blades slid harmlessly across the greased court. The cries of attack changed to screams of pain and horror, and the Northlanders died in agony as they fell on the barricades or were trampled underfoot. Now the elven bowmen loosed their arrows a second time in long, steady waves. The Northlanders, slowed by the barricades blocking their path of attack, were easy targets. Unable to protect themselves with nowhere to hide, they were felled by the dozens. The flames of the grass fires closing in from behind them gave them no chance to retreat. The rest of the Northland Army had split apart in an effort to skirt the centre of the inferno and lend support to those trapped in front. But the positioning of the siege machines and the trains of animals hauling them forward hampered their progress. And now elven cavalry rode at them from both sides, sweeping across their flanks with javelins and short swords. One of the towers caught fire, and in an effort to douse the flames, the occupants frantically splashed down buckets of water drawn from containers stored within the wooden shell. Catapults loosed their deadly hail of stones and jagged metal, but the aim was obscured by the smoke and dust. Then Shannara had the ropes to the spiked barricades released, and the barricades dropped away. The elves marched forward, lances and swords set in staggered lines, their ranks tight, the shield of the man on the right protecting the man on the left. Straight into the ravaged Northland front they marched, a steady, relentless advance. Dismayed at their predicament, the Northlanders, who were trapped between the elves and the fire, threw down their weapons and tried to flee. But there was no escape. They were hemmed in on all sides now, and with no place to go they were quickly cut to pieces. But the grass fires began to die, and a company of rock trolls that had formed the core of the Northern Army's strength marched into view. Their great pikes lowered, they held their ranks and maintained their pace without slowing as they trampled over their own dead and dying, making no distinction between friend and enemy. Anything caught in their path was killed. Shannara saw them coming and gave the order to retreat. He pulled back his front lines to their original position and set them in place again. On his right, Cormoran Etrurian commanded. On his left, Rustin Ap Arnbander set the bowmen amid both companies, staggering their lines, and had them lose their arrows at the advancing trolls. But the trolls were too well armoured for the arrows to do much damage, and the king signalled the archers to fall back. Out of the fire and smoke, the rock trolls marched. The finest fighters in the four lands, massive of shoulder and thigh, heavily muscled, armoured and steady. Shannara signalled anew, and up came a new set of spikes to block their path. But the rock trolls were more disciplined and less easily confused than the gnomes and lesser trolls, and they set themselves in place to push back the spiked barricades. Behind them swarmed the balance of the Northland Army, appearing out of the haze in seemingly endless numbers, hauling with them their siege towers and catapults. Cavalry rode their flanks, engaging Keir Yoplin's command, keeping it at bay. Shannara withdrew his army another 100 yards, well into the broad eastern mouth of the Ren. Line by line, the elves fell back, a disciplined, orderly retreat, but a retreat nevertheless. Some among the Northland Army cheered, believing the elves had panicked. Surely the elves would break and flee, they thought. None among them noticed the lines of small flags through which the elves carefully withdrew, and which they superstitiously removed in their passing. Advancing implacably, relentlessly into the valley, the rock trolls were oblivious to the ordered form of the elven retreat. Behind them, smoke and fire gusted and died as the wind faded with the approach of mid-morning. Keir Yoplin's command rode back into the valley ahead of the Northland assault, anxious to avoid being cut off. They galloped past the foot soldiers and wheeled about on their flanks, forming up anew. The entire Westland army was in place now, stretched across the mouth of the valley, waiting. There was no sign of panic and no hint of uncertainty. They had set a second trap, and the unsuspecting enemy was marching directly into it. So it was that when the front ranks of the rock trolls reached the entrance to the valley, the ground beneath their feet began to give way. The heavily armoured trolls tumbled helplessly into pits the elves had dug and concealed several days earlier, and themselves carefully avoided during their retreat. The ranks parted and moved ahead, avoiding the exposed drops, but there were pits staggered over a span of 50 yards at irregular intervals, and the ground continued to collapse no matter which way the trolls turned. Confusion slowed their advance, and the attack began to falter. Immediately, the elves counterattacked. The king signalled the men concealed on the cliffs to either side. The casks of flammable oil were rolled down hidden ramps onto the grasslands to smash apart as exposed rock and spilled into the pits. Once more fire arrows arched skyward and fell into the spreading oil, and the entire eastern end of the valley was abruptly engulfed in flames. The rock trolls in the pits were burned alive. The balance of the assault came on, but the solidarity of the troll ranks was shattered. Worse, the trolls were being overrun by the unwitting Northlanders who had followed in their wake. Confusion began to overtake the army. The fire chased them. The arrows from the elven longbows fell among them, and now the Elven Army was marching into their midst, bearing massive spiked rams before them. The rams tore into their already decimated ranks and scattered the trolls further. On came the elven hunters, who fell upon the rest with their swords. Those trapped between the elves and the fire stood their ground and fought bravely, but died anyway. In desperation, the remaining Northlanders charged the cliffs to either side of the pass, trying to gain a foothold there, but the elves were waiting once more. Boulders tumbled from the heights and crushed the climbers. Arrows decimated their ranks. From their superior defensive positions, the elves repelled the assault almost effortlessly below in the inferno of the pass. The front quarter of the Northern Army milled about helplessly. The attack stalled and then fell apart, choking on dust and smoke, burned by the grass fires and bloodied by the weapons of the elves. The army of the Warlock Lord began to withdraw once more onto the Strellerheim. Impulsively, Shannara unsheathed the sword entrusted to him by Bremen, the sword whose magic he could not command or even yet believe in, and he thrust it aloft. All about him the elves lifted their own weapons in response and cheered. Almost instantly the king recognized the irony of his gesture. Quickly he lowered the sword once more, a full stick in his hands, a simpleton's charm. As he wheeled Risk about angrily, his euphoria drained from him, and he was replaced by shame. "It is a sword of Shannara now, Elven King," Bremen had told him when he had revealed to the old man after the midnight raid how the talisman magic had failed him. "It is no longer a sword of the Druids, or of mine." The words recalled themselves now as he rode back and forth across his lines, resetting them in preparation for the next attack, the one he knew would probably come just before sunset. The sword was back in its sheath, strapped to his waist, an uncertain, enigmatic presence. For while Bremen had been quick enough to name the sword, he had been slow to provide reassurance that its magic could be mastered. And even now, even with all he knew, Shannara still did not feel as if it was truly his.
It is possible for you to command the magic, Elven King,
the old man had whispered to him that night.
but the strength to do so is born out of belief, and the belief necessarily must come from within you.
They had huddled together in the dark those 10 days earlier, dawn still an hour or more away, their faces smeared with soot and dirt and streaked with sweat. Shannara had come close to dying that night. The Warlock Lord's netherworld monster had almost killed him, and even though Bremen had arrived in time to save him, the memory of how near death had come was yet vivid and raw. Braille was somewhere close, but Yule had chosen to talk with the Druid alone, to confess his failure in private, to exorcise the demons that raged within. He could not live with what had befallen him, if he did not think he could prevent it from happening again. Too much depended on the sword's use. What had he done wrong in calling on the power of the talisman that night? How could he make certain it did not happen again? Alone in the darkness, huddled so that the pounding of their hearts and the heated rush of their breathing was all they could hear, they had confronted the question.
The sword is a talisman meant for a single purpose, Shannara.
The old man had snapped almost angrily, his voice rough and impatient.
It has a single use and no other. You cannot call on the magic to defend you against all creatures that threaten. The blade may save your life, but the magic will not.
The king stiffened at the rebuke. But you said...
Do not tell me what I said.
Bremen's words were sharp and stinging as they cut apart his objection and silenced him.
You were not listening to what I said, Elven King. You heard what you wanted to hear, and no more. Do not deny it. I saw, I watched. This time, pay me better heed. Are you doing so?
Shannara managed a furious, tight-lipped nod, his tongue held in check only by the knowledge that if he failed to do as he was bidden, he was lost.
Against the Warlock Lord, the magic will respond when you call on it, but only against the Warlock Lord, and only if you believe strongly enough.
The grey head shook reprovingly.
Truth comes from belief. Remember that. Truth comes from recognition that it is universal and all-encompassing and plays no favourites. If you cannot accept it into your own life, you cannot force it into the lives of others. You must embrace it first before you can employ it. You must make it your armour.
But it should have served so against that creature, the king insisted, unwilling to admit that his judgment had been wrong. Why did it not respond?
Because there is no deception about such a monster,
the druid replied, his jaw clenched.
It does not do battle with lies and half-truths. It does not armor itself in falsehood. It does not deceive itself into thinking it is something it is not. That, Elven King, is the sole province of the Warlock Lord, and that is why the magic of the sword of Shannara can be used only against him.
So they had debated the argument, raging back and forth, on until dawn, when they had rested at last. Afterward, the king had been left to think on what he had been told, to try and reconcile the words with his expectations. Gradually, he had come to accept that what Bremen believed must be true. The magic of the sword was limited to a single use, and though he might wish it otherwise, there was no help for it. The magic of the sword was meant for Bronar alone, and no other. He must embrace this knowledge, and somehow he must find a way to make the magic, however foreign and confusing, his own. He had gone to prayer finally, having known all along that he would do so eventually, just as he did with all things that troubled him. His counsellors were there to advise him at every turn, and some, especially very Eredin, were worth listening to. But no one knew him as Prayer did, and in truth, none among them was apt to be as honest. So he had made himself confide the truth in her, though it was difficult to admit that he had failed, and was fearful he might fail again. It was later that same day his conversation with Bremen, still fresh in his mind, his memories of the previous night still vivid. The valley of Ren was hushed beneath a clouded sky, and the elves were watchful, wary of a Northland response to the previous night attack. The afternoon was growing slow. The summer heat settled deep within the parched earth of the Strellerheim, the air thick with dampness from the approaching rain. "You will find a way to master this magic," she said at once, when he had finished speaking. Her voice was firm and insistent, and her gaze was steady. "I believe that, Yul. I know you. You have never given up on a challenge, and you will not give up on this one." "Sometimes," he replied quietly, "I think it would be better if Tay were here in my place. He might make a better king. Certainly he would be better suited to wield this sword and its magic." But she shook her head at once. "Do not ever say that again. Not ever." Her clear ginger eyes were bright and sharp. "You were meant to live and be king of the elves. Fate decreed that long ago. Tay was a good friend and meant much to both of us, but he was not destined for this. Listen to me, Yul. The sword's magic will work for you. Truth is no stranger. We have begun our lives as husband and wife by revealing truth that we would not have admitted a month before. We have opened ourselves to each other. It was difficult and painful, but now you know it can be done. You know this. You do." "Yes," he admitted softly, "but the magic still seems—" He faltered. "Unfamiliar," she finished for him, "but it can be made your own. You have accepted that magic as part of your elven history. Tay's magic was real. You have discovered for yourself that it could perform miracles. You watched him give his life in its service. All things are possible with magic, and truth is one of them. Yule, it is a weapon of great power. It can strengthen and it can destroy. Bremen is no fool. If he says that the truth is the weapon you require, then it must be so." But still, it nagged at him, whispered of his doubts and caused him to waver. Truth seemed so small a weapon. What truth could be powerful enough to destroy a being that could summon monsters from the netherworld? What truth was sufficient to counter magic powerful enough to keep a creature alive for 1,000 years? It seemed ludicrous to think that truth alone was sufficient for anything. Fire was needed, iron, sharp-edged and poison-tipped, strength that could split rocks asunder. Nothing less would do. He kept thinking, even as he sought to embrace the magic Bremen offered. Nothing less. Now, riding the battlefield with the sword of Shannara strapped to his side, the elven hunters, buoyed by the euphoria of their victory, he wondered anew at the enormity of the responsibility he had been given to fulfill. Sooner or later he would have to face the Warlock Lord, but that would not happen until he forced the confrontation. That in turn would not happen until the Northern Army itself was threatened. How could he hope to bring such a thing about? For while the elves had held against one assault, there was nothing to say that they would be able to hold against another and another and another after that. The Northern Army coming on relentlessly, and if they did somehow manage to hold, how could he turn the tide of battle so that the elves could take the offensive? There were so many of the enemy, he kept thinking, so many lives to expend, and no thought being given to the waste of it. It was not so for him. Not so for the elves who fought for him. This was a war of attrition, and that was exactly the kind of war he could not hope to win. Yet somehow he must, for that was all that was left to him. That was the only choice he had been given. He must, or the elves would be destroyed. The Northland army came again an hour before sunset, appearing out of the scorched, dusty, smoke-shrouded grassland like disembodied wraiths. Foot soldiers marched in behind massive shields, constructed of wood so green it would not burn. Cavalry rode their flanks to ward against attacks from the cliffs north and south. They advanced slowly and steadily out of the haze, the grass fires having burned themselves out earlier, though the air was still acrid and raw. They skirted the charred pits and their crumpled dead, and once inside the valley they began to probe for new traps. 5,000 strong, they were packed close behind their shields, and their weapons bristled at every turn. The drums beat in steady cadence, and they chanted as they marched, boots thudding, iron blades and wooden harps rapping in time. They brought up their siege towers and catapults, and set them in place at the valley entrance, a vast, dark mass. They rose up against the coming night until it seemed as if there were enough of them to overrun the entire world. Shannara had drawn his army deeper into the valley, bringing them back to a midway point before setting their lines. He had chosen a position where the valley began to rise toward the Wren's narrow western part, giving his hunters the high ground on which to position themselves. His tactics necessarily changed now, for the wind had shifted within the valley, blowing back against the defenders, and fire would only aid the enemy here. Nor had he ordered pits dug this deep within the valley. There would not be enough room to maneuver his own army if he did, and besides, the enemy would be looking for them now. Instead, he had ordered dozens of spiked barricades built, ties sharpened at both ends and lashed crosswise to a central axle, so that they resembled cylindrical pinwheels. Each was 20 feet in length and light enough to haul forward and set in place so that the downward pointing spikes were jammed into the earth. These he had positioned at staggered intervals in a narrow ribbon all across the width of the Wren, just below his forward lines. When the army of the Warlock Lord spilled into the valley and began its determined march forward, the first resistance it encountered was the maze of spiked barricades. As the front ranks of the enemy reached them, Shannara ordered his bowmen, set in lines of 3 behind cover along the slopes, to loose their arrows. The Northlanders, slowed by the barricades and unable to push them aside, could not escape. Caught in a withering crossfire, they were killed by the dozens as they sought to crawl over, under or past the spikes. The cavalry tried to mount a sustained charge against the elves positioned on the heights, but the slopes were too steep for horses, and the Northlanders' riders were swept down again. Screams rose from the dying, and the attack stalled. The Northlanders hid behind their shields, but they could not advance. Their cover beyond the Elven barricades, axes were brought up to hew through the barricades, but those who rushed out to chop apart the spiked pinwheels lasted only moments. Worse, to break past even one of the barricades required cutting it through a dozen places. The light failed, dust descended, and the world turned shadowy and uncertain. The Northlanders brought fire to the barricade and set them ablaze, but the elves had purposely made them of green wood. The grasses caught fire, but the elves had dug trenches to separate themselves from the barricades, and the fires burned themselves out of the east of the defensive lines. The elves waited until darkness to begin and began to mask everything, then counter-attack from the slopes in a series of controlled strikes. Because the elves had the Northlanders bottled up on the valley floor, their target was certain even in the deepening gloom. One company after another came down off the heights, forcing the Northlanders to turn first one way and then another to defend themselves. Fierce hand-to-hand fighting ensued, and the valley became a charnel house. Still the enemy would not fall back. Northlanders died by the hundreds, but there were always more waiting to be brought up. A huge massive force crushing relentlessly inward, even as the elves fought to hold their positions against those already in place. Reinforcements were advancing. Slowly, inexorably, the enemy pushed forward. The barricades held the Northland Army in check at the valley's centre, but the slopes were being overrun. The elves under Cormorant Etrurian, who held the cliffs, were slowly driven from their defensive positions and compelled to fall back. Foot by foot, yard by yard, the Northlanders advanced, seizing the heights and breaking free of the vice that Shannara had clamped about them. Word of what was happening reached the king. The skies were clouded and rain was beginning to fall, turning the ground slick and treacherous. The sounds of battle echoed off the slopes of the valley, creating a maelstrom of confusion. The darkness made it virtually impossible to see anything beyond a few yards. Shannara took only a moment to consider. Quickly he sent runners to withdraw Etrurian's men to the barricades established as a redoubt high on the slope parallel to his own lines. They were to stand and hold. He sent runners to pull back Arnbander and the longbows. Then he marshalled 2 companies of Elven hunters under Rustin App and formed them up to attack. When Etrurian's fighters and the bowmen were safely withdrawn, he ordered pikes brought to the fore, and he marched his command directly into the heart of the enemy advance. He engaged the Northlanders just as they were breaking through on the right flank and pinned their front ranks against the barricades. He ordered torches lit to identify their positions to the re-entrenched bowmen, and then had them rake the enemy from the slopes. Caught in an enfilading fire, the Northlanders rallied under a much clutch of rock trolls and counter-attack. They shoved and twisted their way past the barricades and hammered into the Elven hunters. Huge winged shapes appeared out of the smoky haze as skull bearers took to the skies to lend their support. The line of defence buckled, grizzled. Rustin went down and was carried from the field. True Within and the Home Guard hurried forward to reinforce the sagging defence, but the enemy were too many and the entire Elven front began to collapse. In desperation, Shannara put his spurs to wrist and charged into the battle himself. Surrounded by the Home Guard, he cut his way into the enemy front, rallying his Elven hunters to him. Northlanders came at him from all sides. They tried to drag him from his horse, to knock him from the saddle, to do anything to slow him. Behind him, the Elven army, battered and worn, surged to its collective feet and followed in his wake. Battle cries rose out, and shrieks and moans of the injured and dying, and the elves thrust into the Northlanders yet again. Yule fought as if he might drive the enemy all the way back to the Northland by himself, his gleaming sword catching light from the torches, ringing out as it hammered down against enemy weapons and armour. Massive trolls appeared in his path, great faceless monsters with battle axes, but the king cut his way through them as if they were made of paper, refusing to be stopped. Seemingly invincible, he outdistanced even his personal guard, and his soldiers threw themselves at the enemy in an effort to reach him. Then lightning struck, an outcropping on the slope closest to where the battle was being fought, and fiery clots of earth and shards of broken rock exploded skyward and showered across the valley floor. Men covered their heads and cowered at the fury of the explosion, and for just an instant time froze. As the Northlanders hesitated, turned momentarily to statues, Shannara stood tall in his stirrup and thrust the sword of Shannara skyward in defiance of everything. Battle cries rose from the throats of his men, and they charged into the enemy with such ferocity that they overran them completely. Those farthest away and yet able to escape retreated behind the shattered barricades. The fight gone out of them. For a moment they held their ground in the forest of jagged wooden bones and scorched earth. Then sullenly, wearily, they withdrew to the Ren's East Pass. Massed against the barricades, streaked by rain, dirt, sweat and blood, Shannara and the elves watched them go. The victory for this day, at least, belonged to them.